Okay, I want to welcome all of you that are watching online, whether it's by Facebook or whatever. Glad to have you join us as we study 1 Samuel chapters 5 and 6. These are some wonderful lessons. You know, God is the same God today that he was back in the time of Samuel, and he hasn't changed. His ways haven't changed. And so we can learn much from studying what has been going on with these folks in this time of the nation of Israel. It's a time when they don't have any real leaders. Their high priest Eli has been died. He fell off of a chair and it killed him, broke his neck. And so another man hasn't come up to be the high priest. And we have studied how Samuel was taken to the temple when he was just a small child, very small child. And so he was raised in that temple with the high priest and being prepared to be a priest to serve God. And so now he is older. He's probably in his early 20s, but he is there to take the place that Eli had. So in verse 1 of chapter 5, we read, "And the Philistines took the ark of God." Now, we had studied last week how that the Philistines came in and fought with Israel and won the battle. Many Israelites were killed, and they took the ark from the temple where it had been. Took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer unto Ashdod. Now it's interesting that from when we read about Samuel in the latter part of the chapter 4, and now in these two chapters we're going to be reading today, we don't read anything about Samuel. And so Samuel is still there, and we know just from knowing what would be going on that he has been active in the things of the Lord, and yet the people they weren't following the Lord before he came on the scene, and they're still not following the Lord. And so evidently they don't have any confidence in going to Samuel for things that they need. They're just doing what they want to do in their own mind. Everyone doing what was right in his own mind. We read that in Judges, and that's what they are doing. So when they fought this battle with the Israelites, they took the ark, and they knew that it was a very important piece of furniture, and they knew that really it represented the God of Israel. And they realized they didn't understand God at all, but they realized that it was a very important piece of furniture concerning their God. And so they took this. It says it brought it from Ebenezer unto Ashdod. Ebenezer is the name of a stone that they had confidence in, some big stone. And so they took it, but from this stone, where evidently there was a lot of going on in this fighting between the two countries, the Israelites and the Philistines. During this time, right after they had this battle, and so the ark was taken, but it was put first on this stone of Ebenezer, and then it was taken to Ashdod, which was one of the countries around there. And it says, verse 2, "When the Philistines took the ark of God, they brought it into the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon." Dagon was their god, and it was just an idol, where the Israelites' God was in heaven, and it was a wonderful, real God. I started to say real, he wasn't human, but he was God. And he was God that made all the humans and made even the Philistines. But anyway, they took this ark and set it in the house of Dagon, which was their god. This god, which, like I said, it's just an idol that they had made, and it says that the top of that idol was the head of a woman, and the body was like a fish. So, crazy looking thing. Can you imagine them getting their confidence in something like that, praying to it, and so on? But now they had the ark that belonged to Israel and set it there in the same house with this terrible idol, and set it in front of it. But I had wanted to read a little bit of what had gone on. Keep your place in Samuel, but turn to Psalms chapter 78. And I've got a different paper here that I want to. In beginning to study this chapter, I took out a different paper than what I wanted to have here when I was giving out the lesson. So you'll have to forgive me just for a few minutes till I can find it. That's got it with all these papers. Next time I'll just put the papers that I am going to be studying off of here. Just a minute. Yes, here it is. Because there's a place in Psalm 78 I want you to turn to. Psalm 78, we're going to be reading from verse 50, 52 or 53. This is telling us a little bit more. In 1 Samuel, a certain part of the history that went on at this time was not written in 1 Samuel, but in Psalm 78, we have more understanding of what has been going on with the Philistines fighting against Israel. Well, I'll get to it here. Okay, Psalm 78, verse 52, but made his own people to go forth with the sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. This is talking about what God did. He led them on safely so that they feared not, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. And he brought them to the border of the sanctuary, even to the border of the mountain which his right hand had purchased. He cast out the heathen who before them, and divided them an inheritance by the line, and made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. This is talking there about God taking care of Israel during this time, before the Philistines came and fought them at that time. But it says in verse 56, after God had done all of that for them, yet they tempted and provoked the Most High God and kept not his testimonies. So that's what Israel, that was their response to all of this wonderful care that God is giving them. It says, but they turned back and dealt unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow. For they provoked him to anger with their high places and moved him to jealousy with their graven images. See, they had these crazy images that they had made themselves that they were serving also. Verse 59, when God heard this, he was wroth and greatly abhorred Israel, so that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh. This is why the Philistines were able to come and fight and get the ark, because God had forsaken the tabernacle of Shiloh. That's where the tent, the ark was, in the tabernacle which was in Shiloh. In verse 61, he delivered his strength into captivity, delivered Israel's strength, and his glory into the enemy's hand. He gave his people over also unto the sword, and was wroth with his inheritance. The fire consumed their young men, and their maidens were not given to marriage. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. And so that's all we'll read for now. But when they were doing all these things, the Philistines, they fought Israel, they killed many of them, and then they went to the temple where it was in Shiloh, and they wrecked it and took the ark and probably destroyed a lot of what they had there, a lot of the things. It was a terrible time that God, because of Israel's disobedience and worshiping idols themselves, he just turned away from them and let the Philistines do what they wanted to do. So, now back in...
Now, why did Israel do that? They just lost heart?
I guess so. It's just the same way that you read all through the Old Testament, and you'll see how Israel would follow the Lord for a little bit, and then they would start following and worshiping their idols and turn away from God. God would come and he'd bring judgment, so they'd turn back to God. Then pretty soon they'd go again with their idols. It was just the way that they were. And sad to say, there's so many today that are the same way.
Of the Israelites?
Not only of the Israelites, of people. So many people will follow God for a while, and then they'll see something they want in the world, a worldly something, and they'll leave the Lord and follow this other whatever is before them. That's the way people are if they're not turning to the Lord and following him.
And what causes them then to hold to the Lord?
Isn't it the leaders? Because I was reading in the Old Testament through it, that I noticed that if the king was following the Lord, the people would follow the Lord. If it was an evil king, they would go back to their idols.
They'd go back to, yeah.
That's what kept them.
So
But it wasn't always the case. They had some good kings,
Right.
and
They
Israel
had a
did
lot of
not
bad
follow
kings.
God.
So then if they like the pastor, they'll stay. If they don't like the pastor, they'll take a hiatus?
Well,
Some people will do that. We see people today the same way that they were in the Old Testament times, and some in the New Testament times, will follow the Lord for a while, then they're not willing to give up their life. The Lord wants us to be willing to give up our own desires, our own thinking, our own problems, and follow him. That's what the Lord wants. But people don't always do that.
Well, and they can't say that it's what the pastor says, because the Bible and what they teach goes right along.
That's right. That's right. But let's go ahead with what they're doing here. Reading back in 1 Samuel chapter 5, when the Philistines took the ark and put it in the same place as Dagon, their idol. Now notice verse 3. And when they of Ashdod, where the ark was, arose early on the morrow, behold, Dagon was fallen on his face to the earth before the ark of the Lord. So their idol had fallen down and fallen in front of the ark that was there. And verse 4, and when they rose early on the morrow morning, the next morning, behold, Dagon was fallen on his face. First they put Dagon back up. They had to set their own god back up. But now, in verse 4, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the ground before the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off from the threshold, upon the threshold. Only the stump of Dagon was left to him. Now that should have shown those Philistines. Here,
He can't stand up.
he can't stand up. His head, he can't think. His head is gone. And his two hands, he can't fight for them. He can't do anything for them. You'd think that that would cause them to say, hey, this is not right then. He can't be a God that we can trust. And so let's go follow the Israelites' God. The ark was still there all during that time. But no, and that's the way people are today too. God will do things, wonderful things. And people sometimes they even acknowledge that had to be God. But will they follow God?
Just like the thing with what's his name, our wonderful one that we love, and he kept telling him, and then his wife said, "Why didn't you do this?" Who am I trying to say? The one we love so much, and his wife said, "Why didn't you do this?" Jonathan, no.
I'm not sure who you're talking
Oh,
about.
I'm sorry.
Job.
No.
No.
Are you talking about some
John,
of
the wonderful that we love so much, and his wife, and he finally just left his wife, and he would never touch her again, or ever did touch her, I guess.
I'm not sure, but let's go ahead here because anyway, only the stump of Dagon was left there. Therefore, instead of realizing what they should do, notice what the Philistines did now. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor any that came unto Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon and Ashdod unto this day, the time that they were writing this. Because his hands and his head had fallen on the threshold there where the ark was, they thought that threshold was holy because their idol had fallen on it. And so that made it holy in some way. And so they wouldn't step on it. They were showing more respect to that threshold. It's so foolish. We can look at it now and say how foolish that was. But I'm afraid that we are fooled sometimes also. But let's go on. Verse 6, but the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them of Ashdod. God was understanding and knowing what was going on, and he wasn't pleased. He said he destroyed them and smote them with emerods, even Ashdod and the coasts thereof. Now, emerods were, some said that it was kind of like our hemorrhoids, and others said it was either tumors or boils. So it was some hard and painful sickness, disease that fell upon these men in those places, in Ashdod, all in Ashdod. Verse 7, and when the men of Ashdod saw that it was so, they said, the ark of the God of Israel shall not abide with us, for his hand is sore upon us and upon Dagon our God. So they're having to do something to take care of their own idol, their own God. But they have seen now that this must be something from Israel's God, because they had the ark there. Verse 8, they sent therefore and gathered all the lords of the Philistines unto them, the Lord speaking of the leaders, and said, what shall we do with the ark of God of Israel? And they answered, let the ark of the God of Israel be carried about unto Gath. Take it to a different place. And they carried the ark of the God of Israel thither. They took it to Gath, another city there. And it was so that after they had carried it about, the hand of the Lord was against the city with a great destruction. And what did he do there to ones in Gath? The same thing. He brought all of those emerods on them. And he smote the city, both small and great. They had emerods in the secret parts. And that's why some have thought that it was like a problem with hemorrhoids today. And those people during that time believed that if you had a problem in the secret parts, like that would have been, that was God's displeasure with you, that it was from God, and it was because God wasn't pleased with you. And so God knew what they thought. He knew just where to cause them to have these problems. Therefore, in verse 10, they sent the ark of God to Ekron. Okay, we'll go to a different place then. And it came to pass, as the ark of God came to Ekron, that the Ekronites cried out, saying, they have brought about the ark of the God of Israel to us to slay us and our people. They didn't like that, and I don't blame them. They didn't want that ark there. Verse 11, so they sent and gathered together of the lords of the Philistines, again the leaders of them, and said, send away the ark of the God of Israel, and let it go again to its own place, that it slay us not and our people, for there was a deadly destruction throughout all the city. So they had God had caused them to have problems. The hand of God was very heavy there. And the men that died not were smitten with the emerods, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. Because it has them in two separate sentences or thoughts here, says there was men that died, or there was a deadly destruction through all the city. Shows that God had brought a lot of ones to be killed. And there was evidently some kind of something that went on that caused them to be killed. And then the ones that weren't killed in this whatever problem it was, the ones that weren't killed had to deal with these emerods, and that caused the death of most of them. So their cry went up to the city. Then we go ahead with chapter 6. And the ark of the Lord was in the country of the Philistines 7 months. That's quite a while for it to be in the ark to be there for 7 months. And the Philistines called for the priests and the diviners. The diviners, they're magicians, thinking, oh, well, all of this was Satan leading them, because those magicians couldn't help them. But they called for them, saying, what shall we do to the ark of the Lord? Tell us wherewith we shall send it to its place. What can we do with all of this? They didn't. And I wonder if some of the, maybe not the leaders, and that's who they were talking to and who was making these decisions, but if there weren't others, maybe there were some of their wives or others that knew what was going on, if it would have caused them to turn to the Lord. I think it probably did. There were probably individuals that would accept the Lord at that time and cry out to the Lord, because God knows what he's doing and he knows how to draw people. So anyway, the scripture doesn't talk about those, but it says, verse 3, if they said, if ye send away the ark of God of Israel, send it not empty, but in any wise return him a trespass offering. This is like a guilty offering of guilt. They were felt guilty. Well, they were guilty. It says, then you shall be healed, and it shall be known to you why his hand is not removed from you. So they're beginning to think a little bit more correctly. Then said they, what shall be the trespass offering that we shall return to him? They answered, 5 golden emerods and 5 golden mice, according to the Philistines, for 1 plague was on you all and on your lords. Now the mice hadn't been mentioned before, but because of this verse, and as the story goes on, we can tell that God not only brought emerods to cause them a lot of physical problems, but he brought a lot of mice that would come and probably would eat all of their crops and be just a real problem to all of them. And so they said, you make something that looks like the emerods with gold. Just make 5. And it said 5 because there were 5 different cities around there that were involved more with these problems and what to do with the ark and all. And so God was bringing judgment on every one of them. And these 5 cities each one of them had a leader over them, which is called the lords of those cities. And so he says, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines, for 1 plague was on you all and on your lords. These leaders had a problem with these emerods also. Therefore you shall make images of your emerods and images of your mice that mar the land, and ye shall give glory unto the God of Israel. Now notice that. God knows how to get glory, even from enemies. He says, you shall give glory to the God of Israel. And I think that's so interesting and wonderful that God will. And there again, I just can't help but believe that there were some individuals that would acknowledge the God of Israel enough to not want to follow the Philistines' god, Dagon. It says, peradventure he will lighten his hand from off you and from off your gods and from off your land. This is their leaders telling them what to do. Verse 6, wherefore then do you harden your hearts, as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? When he had wrought wonderfully among them, did they not let the people go, and they departed? So that had been many years before this, that Israel was in Egypt and needed to leave Egypt, and God sent all these problems to the Egyptians in order to let his people go. But these Philistines had heard all about that. They knew about that. They should have turned to the Lord in the first place, to the God of Israel, and not follow their own idols that they made themselves and that couldn't help them at all. But they didn't. You just wonder at the hardness of people's hearts, because it's the same way today. People can see all kinds of miracles, or they can know that, that God has been working and so on, and yet they're not willing to leave their own ways they've been doing and follow God. Their hearts are hard. So then they go ahead and tell him something else to do in verse 7. Now therefore make a new cart, take two milk kine cows, on which there hath come no yoke, and tie the kine to the cart, and bring their calves home from them. So he said, you make a new cart. Now to make things new and to deal with new things was showing respect to the ones they are dealing with. That was the way they felt in those days. It was showing respect. So they did everything they knew to do to show respect, everything except turning and following them and leaving their idols. But it said, leave the calves at home and hook the cows up to this new cart. Verse 8, and take the ark of the Lord and lay it upon the cart, and put the jewels of gold which you return him for a trespass offering, a guilt offering, in a coffer by the side thereof, and send it away that it may go. So they were to make little things out of gold to look like the boils or hemorrhoids, whatever, and then make little mice, make that out of golden things, and put those in. If they knew anything at all about the God of Israel, they would have known there had to be a blood offering, not these things that they made. We can't please God with something that we do ourselves and not follow God's ways. And they were doing all of this. It was foolish, but they did it, what their leaders told them to do. Verse 9, and see if it goeth up by the way of his men, of his own coast to Bethshemesh, then he that hath done us this great evil, which was God. But if not, then we shall know that it is not his hand that has smote us, but it was a chance that happened unto us, just a chance happening. So they did that. I'll go ahead and read a little bit. And the men did so, and took 2 milk kine cows, and tied them to the cart, and shut up their calves at home. And they laid the ark of the Lord upon the cart, and the coffer with the mice. The coffer is just this little something that they made to put the golden mice and all in, and the images of their emeralds. And the kine took the straight way to the way of Bethshemesh, and went along the highway, lowing as they went, and turned not aside to the right hand or to the left. And the lords of the Philistines went after them unto the border of Bethshemesh. So they did all of this, and then the leaders of the Philistines followed these 2 cows to see what they would do. Well, when when a cow has given birth to a calf, can you cause them to just walk away from that calf? It's completely out of order as far as natural things go. Those cows wouldn't have left those calves and walked that way. They would have just stayed back and made sure they had their calves with them, or stay with the calves. So it was a correct thing for these Philistines to do, to use this method to see, to make sure whether all of these problems that were coming upon them was really from God, the God of Israel, or was it just happenstance that it would do that? So they did that, and then the leaders of the Philistines, these 5 lords, 5 leaders, they walked behind the cattle to see what they would do, see where they would go. That's okay. God doesn't mind when people do something like this to make sure of something. But in verse 13, they of Bethshemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley, and they lifted up their eyes and saw the ark and rejoiced to see it. Can you imagine their joy when they saw that ark coming and these cattle bringing it on this cart? They hadn't had it. It had been gone for 7 months, and now it was coming. They didn't have to fight for it. You know, I'm sure they thought a lot about fighting against the Philistines and trying to get that ark back. Or maybe giving the Philistines so much amount of money or something to get the ark back. They didn't have to do anything. They were minding their own business, working in the field, and looked up and saw this ark coming with those cattle. You can imagine their joy. And they rejoiced, said they lifted up their eyes, saw the ark, and rejoiced to see it. And the cart came into the field of Joshua, a Bethshemite, and stood there. Now this Bethshemesh was one of the cities that had been given, you know, when Joshua, not this Joshua it's talking about here, but when Joshua, God told him to divide the land. They had won Jericho and all, and God told him to divide the rest of the land between all of the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, a part of that land was to be given to the priests for them, and because they were separate from the others in Israel. And so they did. They gave these 5 cities, I think it was 5, to the priests, and Bethshemesh was one of them. So the ones that working in this Bethshemesh was one of the cities that belonged to the priests. Why would God allow them to take it to the priests and not to one of the other cities?
The priests were the only ones that were supposed to deal with the ark.
That's right. They were the only ones that could do anything with the ark. God was in everything that was going on here. He was doing exactly what needed to be done. So, in verse 14, the cart came into the field of Joshua, a Bethshemite, and stood there, and there was a great stone, and they clave the wood of the cart and offered the kine on a burnt offering unto the Lord. So they made use of the cart, caused it to be the wood where they could make a fire, and then they made use of the cattle, killed them and offered them as sacrifices unto the Lord, and rejoiced. Verse 15, the Levites took down the ark of the Lord. That's the ones that were, the priests were of the Levites. And the coffer that was with it, wherein the jewels of gold were, and put them on the great stone. And the men of Bethshemesh offered burnt offerings and sacrificed sacrifices the same day unto the Lord. You know, I'm sure that they were rejoicing and happy and calling others, their neighbors, and that where there had been just a few working in the field, they called others, and there were probably many there. Verse 16, when the 5 lords of the Philistines had seen it, they were ones that had followed the ark to see what would happen, they returned to Ekron the same day. And these are the golden emerods which the Philistines returned for a trespass offering unto the Lord, for Ashdod 1, for Gaza, and for Ascalon, and for Gath 1, for Ekron 1. Just one for each one of those towns that had been suffering so much from what God was bringing upon them at that time. And verse 18, the golden mice, according to the number of all the cities of the Philistines, belonging to the 5 lords, both of fenced cities and of country villages, even unto the great stone of Abel. That's what this stone where they had stopped was called, Abel. And Abel means, what does it mean? I have a meaning of it here. Means meadow, because that's where it was. It just means meadow. But the great stone of Abel, whereon they set down the ark of the Lord, which stone remaineth unto this day in the field of Joshua the Bethshemite. So everything's wonderful now. But then what happened? Verse 19. And he, speaking of God, smote the men of Bethshemesh because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. Even he smote of the people 50,010 men. And the people lamented because the Lord had smitten many of the people with a great slaughter. So, why did he kill them? Smote means to kill. Why did he kill them at this point? They had offered this offering, this sacrifice. They had rejoiced and praised the Lord for what he had done. But it says because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. God had given them specific instructions when he had them make this ark and all, specific instructions not for that they could not look into the ark.
Verse 20.
Yes. Verse 20. And the men of Bethshemesh said, who is able to stand before this holy Lord God? And to whom shall he go up from us? And they sent messengers to the inhabitants of Kirjath-jearim, saying, the Philistines have brought again the ark of the Lord. Come ye down and fetch it up to you. So, they had done all of this, yet God killed many of them. And so they were afraid to do anything else with that ark. They were afraid to keep it even. They called someone else, come and take it to you. Yeah.
I ain't doing it.
But, you know, that might seem, and it does seem to the natural mind, a terrible thing for God to do. Well, all they did was look in the ark. They had already given up these offerings, killed these animals and rejoiced with the Lord and killed the animals and give as offering as a sacrifice and so on. And God was pleased with them enough to bring the ark to them. So why did he kill them? Just for that little thing of looking in the ark? And I'm sure that they were curious, you know, were the Philistines do anything harm to it? Did they put anything in or take anything out of the ark? And you know, it doesn't say a word about in this instruction. It doesn't say whether the Philistines had looked in.
When it said that, they needed to go by the deal that was set.
Yeah, that's right. But before that, concerning the Philistines, did they look into the ark to see what was in it? We don't know, but I would imagine they did, because naturally speaking, you'd think, well, what's in here and so on. The Bible doesn't say that, so I don't know. But even if they did, God didn't kill any of them for doing that, because it wasn't their ark God wasn't dealing with them. It wasn't, God just passed over that if they did. But for the people of Beth-Shemesh, these Israelites, and even the Levites, they were Levites. But he had told them only the high priest could even be in that place where the ark was, and that only once a year with an offering of blood. So they should not have done that. They were going against what orders God had told them a long time ago. Alice?
Well, we can sacrifice, we can worship, but disobedience, God can't bless that.
That's right.
And that was disobedience.
That was disobedience. God will not let that go. We might disobey in some way and not have any repercussion from God for a long time.
But we're gonna read.
But we will, because God does not forget those things. He wants obedience. That's what God is after. And if our heart is right, we will obey. If we disobey, it's because we think, oh, well, that's not going to hurt. This won't hurt anything. You know, it's just a little thing that we're doing. It won't hurt anything. That's not the way God sees it. And so I think this is something we all need to really take, just think about and take.
And that next, on chapter 7, it says the ark brought to the house of Abinadab the revival at Mitzvah. God wants us to have a revival. He wants us to be happy
Yes,
that we do the things that we do, but he wants us to do what he says.
that's right. He wants us to obey him. So,
And it's for our benefit.
that's right.
Always.
So anyway, many of them were smitten. Now here where it says 50,000 and then 70 men,
Where are you?
the last, verse 19 of chapter 6. Many people in commentaries I've read and others places have said that this 50,000 probably shouldn't be here because they have said that Beth Shemesh was a small city, country, whatever it was village. It was very small and there wouldn't have been 50,000 people there. Well, I'm very hesitant to make changes like that. And I can imagine that they called a lot of their friends and neighbors and a lot of people where could have been 50,000 there. And so this would have been 50,070. So, but I'm bringing that out because you might read of that or hear of that. Many people think that this was a mistake, shouldn't be there. I don't think it was. I think that God showed his displeasure in this way, and it's very serious. And all of those people that were there, they must have all been agreeable to look into that ark and see about it, because God is very just also in his judging of people. But
It makes you wonder about it because when David wants to bring the ark to Jerusalem,
Yes.
and that young man, the only one that died was that young man that touched the ark.
Yes.
that's right. God was serious about that ark. He is just as serious about his things today and how we handle situations with him. If he has told us not to do something or not to be involved in something,
It says he's a very jealous God.
he is very jealous God. We need to obey him in every instance, in every way that we can, and not take things. See,
See there?
these people were taking things in their own hands because of what they thought. Forget about what we think if it goes against what God has said. We have to obey God. And that, to have his blessing. Of course, Jesus died on the cross for our sins. Our sins are covered. And he doesn't take our lives because of that, because of sinning. But if he's not pleased with our way we're going, and if we are disobeying, he isn't pleased with, we will suffer repercussions.
God's intent from the very beginning was that Israel would show God to the rest of the world.
Yes.
And that's his purpose for us, that we would show in whatever way Jesus.
Yes.
And when we are disobedient, then Jesus isn't being made manifest.
That's right. So, the Lord willing, we'll take up chapter 7 next week and see what they do next. So.